It's the continued genocidal Indian policies of the United States government.
We're still struggling for our self-determination, our sovereignty, our nation.
Hello. Good morning. It's another edition of the show. I'm Matthew Hunter. Early morning here. 7 a.m. on the West Coast. Had very little caffeine, but we're here for the long haul. I'm very excited for this show. I'm joined by the one and only Sungmanitu from the Chunka and Luta network, indigenous organizer and activist and expert on the American Indian movement. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Just in the middle of moving, so sorry about all the boxes and stuff. But
no worries.
Can't seem to stay in one place.
No worries. First off, I just want to give you sort of the opening here to sort of give your experience organizing and activism in indigenous communities, as well as obviously this is slightly a fundraiser for an upcoming research trip for you. As you see down below, if you're watching on YouTube and Twitch, donate right there, Cash App and PayPal, right? Is it PayPal?
Venmo.
Venmo.
There's a PayPal too, but it's I don't like giving that one out. Just
no worries.
I'm not probably sure how Elon Musk does taxes the best.
Cash App and Venmo right there, okay, down below. So throughout the show, just donate. We're gonna try to get this research trip funded. But anyways, just want to give you the floor to give your experience organizing.
So it's kind of confusing. Like my family is American Indian Movement member. Well, they are. It's confusing how that goes. And so I was kind of born into it. But overall, my actual organizing myself, that like I was conscious of what I was doing, and like I was making the decision rather than just being like walked down a road. Hey, I was probably in like 18, 19. It was actually no, I would have been like 16 with the Flint water crisis, and then like cleaning up the Rouge River. But that's like very not. Everyone should do that. It's the bare minimum, right? But like communist organizing and stuff, I started like around 18, 19 after pretty interesting period of my life where I dated an FBI agent's daughter, and I thought, well, hey, they're not like they were back in the day, and like how my elders always told me they were. And then they learned them I'm related to AIM people, and they were like, everything changed. The tone really shifted, and I was like, what happened? But anyway, I started like off just in the local area with like community gardens, and just trying to connect with people through growing an orchard was one of the first projects like I took on. And today it produces fruit, and like I get to see the fruits of my labor, oh wow, oh my god, it's like 7 years ago, I don't know, but forever, almost a decade ago I did this. And so that was like my first foray as I was becoming more radical. I had tried to commit suicide. Can I say that? I don't know if that gets people banned. I always see
no, it's
videos.
totally fine. And
Okay.
I've talked about it before, and usually at the bottom of the description of the show, I put links for self-help or prevention hotline, stuff like that. So yes, definitely, if you need to mention that. Mental health is important.
Yeah, so I had tried to kill myself, and it gave me a respite of time ordered by my therapist where I wasn't supposed to like work for a year, and I just lived in my dad's house, and yeah, I went through a fairly tumultuous period, but I started like diving deeper into theory because I was like, I had read State and Rev by that time, and when I was younger, I did this. Well, I got to hear everybody's point of view, and so like I read like F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and I was like, this guy sucks. And then like Michael Harrington, who's like a social democrat, even Chapo's Trap House freaking makes fun of, you know. So if those guys are making fun of him, he's really not the greatest. And then Mutual Aid by Peter Kropotkin. And after reading that, I asked my friend who recommended it. I was like, "Hey, got anything else that good?" Stay in Rev. Okay. And then I got it. I started listening to like podcasts like Pros of the Round Table, Citations Needed, Rev Left Radio, blah blah blah. And then that got me more interested in serious organizing. But what I realized was there was always these brief mentions of the American Indian movement, right? And nobody really has any depth to their discussion on AIM. They can tell you a lot. Well, not a lot. I wish people could tell you more about the Black Panther Party, but people can tell you a lot about them comparatively to AIM, which they can give you like a brief, it's an organization about American Indians, you know, whatever they think is the right thing to say at that moment. But it's a very complex story that has several different factions eventually, and then today exists in this very weird form where you still have a national organization, but then there's these autonomous sectors that kind of were disillusioned with the centralized power structure that existed at the time due to lying, misogyny, and a bunch of other liberalisms, because these weren't communists. There were some communists involved, but they were radical liberals. I mean, like today, I've met a lot of who I had viewed as heroes since I was a child, you know, and I've met them, and all I can say now is don't meet your heroes. I've never not been disappointed by a human being that I've met that I once cherished as, you know, some great person I need to like look up to and become or respect, you know. So yeah, then because of that, the podcast and stuff, I was like, oh, I'll start talking about it more, and eventually, I was my first episode was launched by Pros of the Round Table, and then what happened? Oh, somebody from Jacobin approached me, was like, "Hey, you wanna do this documentary on the Wounded Knee occupation for like I don't know, it was like 15,000, and then like that pays for labor and stuff, but like that was the total project budget initially, and then we got funding from the Real News Network and Patreons and stuff like that. I think we got a grant from somebody else too. I can't remember. But at the time, I was not organizing with anyone. I tried a brief little DSA club that kind of fell apart where I'm at. It's a college town where they were at, and they weren't going to like the rural areas where I'm from. And so like there was definitely a conflict of material conditions, and then they would be gone in 4 years. So, and I'm like the only one who at least would come back or have, you know, long stints in the area, specifically in rural places. I've also lived in the city, and by city, it's like 30,000 people. It's not a big place. Very, very rural population in the upper peninsula of Michigan. But it's it's so like it's just a very interesting place to organize in, and a lot of it is like labor-based organizing. So like I would do a lot of cooking with unions and stuff. On Labor Day, they feed the entire town that I took the majority of my primary education. Is that what it's got? I don't know, but grade school, I took most of my education in this town, and every Labor Day they'd feed the entire town like good portions of food, and it's like traditional food for the area. So like one of the things is kudigi, which is like Sicilian immigrants here took fennel out of Italian sausage, put some wine and cinnamon in it, call it kudigi. But and then there's pasties, the Cornish pasties. But they're very popular here because they were useful to eat in the mines. And so like a lot of my education was very focused on unions in public school, and then Michigan happens to have one of the better public school educations on Native American issues. And so confusingly enough, that all played into me talking about imperialism and stuff. Like I got taught about imperialism pretty extensively in school. I went to an alternative school eventually. And so like when I started podcasting, I was like, this all just makes sense to me. I've been learning about this my whole life. And I was just basically doing reports that I did in grade school as episodes. And so Jacobin goes, hey, we'll pay you for this stuff you're doing free. And I was like, yeah, sure. And then it's now taken like 5 years, because I've accidentally taken on way too much of a task in studying this. But because of that, I've had, travel across the country paid for. I've had to raise my own money, make my own money in many different ways. Tamales is one. I cook. That's like my thing. And so like I'll sling tamales in bars and stuff. Now it's actually kind of legal. I'm like doing a ghost kitchen thing, but through my workplace, I'm like, hey, give me a key. I'm going to come work on my off hours. So I got to pay for it somehow, right? And then, e-begging and podcasting. But that's a long-winded way of saying I've now been like going across the country, and I've been to like 53 reservations now. Talked to many different urban centers and even some suburbs, those were the weird trips, not gonna lie. Interesting beliefs amongst the suburbanites. But I've just been learning the on-the-ground conditions of a lot of different people through various moments of the last 5 years across the country, and it's a very unique position to be in, especially because I'm also talking to these veteran organizers and activists and stuff, some of who are still not willing to share their identity. Like there's literally people I've talked to that I can't talk about, won't ever say what they've said to me, and I'm just like, yeah. And so like and then that turned into the Chunka Luta network, which it's trying to do land projects wherever we're invited. That's the big thing. And then another big thing is I don't know what the right words are, but we have standards, I guess, is the big thing where if people's, I don't know what the word is, but expectation is to like make money off of this. They're obviously not, it's not easy to work with them. And it's like, no, we're going to lose a lot of money. Like the goal is to build infrastructure to sustain us freely so we could remove ourselves from the money.
Trying to explain like long-term social investment. Sometimes it's very hard for people that just want like short-term return on investment, right? Like if you're looking for people to like invest in like a land project or like an infrastructure project, I can imagine that's difficult.
Oh, exactly. And then this is, we were primarily organizing on Pine Ridge, and some complications happened, and the safety of people became issue. And so for now, it's strategic retreat. Unfortunately, while we investigate further, it should have been a better investigation before acting. That's the big takeaway. But also, the conditions are changing very fast. So it's without living there. That's when we had people on the ground there daily. That's when we started to have a fuller understanding of the contradictions that are being organized and overcome there. And so it's a very look forward to a post-mortem, if you will. It's not actually a post-mortem, but a self-criticism and a reflection of what happened, and a further explanation. There was a gun stolen and stuff like it. It's a crazy story. Anyway, but yeah, and I've taken like the whole winter kind of coping with what's gone down. Anyway, but here I am. But yeah, so organizing through CLN, there's other projects that we just don't like to publicize and talk about because that's not strategically advantageous to us, especially if things went down the way they did with the publicized projects. You know, and then when you see ACP doing the same kind of media model, it's like, yeah, I knew how to game the algorithm, but I'm not a piece of shit. I try to be honest is my policy. I'll explain to people, I am using you for engagement. I am engaging with you and debating you so I can drive attention to other posts like fundraising.
Exactly. Someone in the chat is like, ignore the ACP. Yep. You have to.
See,
at least on Twitter, you have to a degree.
Yeah, on Twitter. My issue is a lot of people aren't aware of the history of how things happened and like how, I mean, like some of the ACP's like main members fucking came from the Red Nation while I was with them. Like they were in my fucking, like I organized with them. And so to see the turn and how little is being combated as far as the roots of these threads that they can pull on to push their reactionary views. You know, what I want is people to realize, you know, there's a certain contradiction not going challenged in most parties, even in TRN, apparently. Like, so it's like if even the indigenous Marxist org that everybody knows isn't fucking, sorry, I'm no longer part of TRN. Try not to sound too snide about them. But, you know, if they're not even challenging the contradictions at hand that create people like the ACP, why? What is the failure in study? Why is this so common even in anti-colonial or decolonial space? It's a really big question that I don't think people have a full enough grasp on the entire situation, because I talk to everybody. I don't have an opinion on, you know, whether CPUSA needs to be dismantled or not. I see them all as not the vanguard. You know, I see them as an attempt towards something. And it's like, should you join them? Should you not? I don't care. You should organize, you know, with a group of people that can hold you accountable. You know,
I'm obviously in CPUSA for those who don't know. It's one of those big critiques I have. I mean, I think the first like ever article that's published by the party newspaper or party, you know, website, whatever it is, on like settler colonialism, I believe is in like 2022. Like that's like the oldest one I can find. There might be older ones, you know, obviously like Political Affairs was around for a long time. It's harder to find, you know, some of their archives. Settler colonialism as a concept's been around since at least the 70s in terms of like academic study on it. So it's possible, but the fact that so many major national orgs in socialist spaces have been so late to the ball game, so to speak, on this concept is a problem. And it's one that I hope is fixed ASAP, as you know, obviously contradictions are changing and rapidly developing. But it's something that's clearly an issue, you know, this sort of white chauvinism, national chauvinism. It's a rampant issue amongst even Marxist communist organizations in settler colonies, like the SACP, the South African Communist Party, famously, very famously, like I forget what year it was, like marched down Johannesburg when there was predominantly a white party and was pretty much preaching that white workers of the world unite. Like that was a exact quote I want to say is white workers of the world unite. Like there's this real unfortunate
Kill the Boer.
It's a real unfortunate history that some of these parties have in terms of just racial chauvinism. I mean, even as somebody that's in those big national organizations, I see that critique, and I think it's something that we definitely need to address significantly.
Well, I think a big part of it is not understanding the whole history of why things are this way. Like a lot of it is so naturalized effort. I would say it was purposeful at the beginning, and now it's iffy on whether they're purposely. It's just ingrained in the settler subconscious, right? And because of like just social, what's it called, reinforcement and stuff, to commit genocide, like to put it the most simplest way. It's not a moral thing or anything. This is what's happening. We call the term autogenocide. The society is built in a way that automatically will kill us, and if we don't resist. And a lot of that is due to like, first off, murder, okay, but like diet, lack of healthcare, a bunch of different things. Our housing is barely housing. Like people freeze to death in their own homes constantly. That was a big focus of our organizing, was winter drives to bring wood to Pine Ridge, and this was the first year I didn't do one in like 3 years. So it was hard. Winter was very sad for me, and because I was making a conscious choice not to organize and to rest because of just extreme burnout and trauma, for lack of a better brief explanation. And so it's really, what is a home if you die in it, like, sure, not homeless, but you just died.
Yeah.
A lot of that has to do with like lack of electricity and shit. And yeah.
And don't beat yourself up too much. And people need to take rest. I mean, burnout is a real thing in organizing that I've seen. People just over capacity themselves, and put way too much on their plate. If you needed to take a rest, you needed to take a rest. That's important.
Exactly. And it's been interesting. I met a lot of great people, and a lot of stuff has come further down the line. Like I was just passing the ball, like I made the right connections between people for things to happen in a good way, and so I don't regret what happened or anything, or not organizing this winter, but it's definitely something that I wish more people were organizing better for these things. Like the best way would be to get people like new propane tanks, and we have a deal with Oklahoma tribes for natural gas at $250 for a huge house worth of propane, just flat out. And that was a deal that had to be brokered after the U.S. sanctioned Venezuela so much that we could no longer get our gas from them, which Chavez was giving us at a very cheap rate because of the conditions. So it's interesting what is happening there and what I've seen and how I've come to know it, because a lot of it is around this topic, the American Indian movement. It's talking to people to try to like really get to the essence of the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, which is a very famous incident where the hamlet of Wounded Knee, which it's right by where I Sundance. It's a landmarker for us when driving. It's a mass grave from the 1890 massacre, And yeah, it's weird to use a mass grave as a land marker. I'm just, I was born with a concentration camp number, so it's like, like there's a cognitive dissonance when people are like talking about how free this place is. It's like I'm just forced to be here, like I don't have a choice. You guys are occupying us, and so, in this organizing, I've become part of the story. I guess I kind of describe it as, in that, when we're talking about the legacy of AIM, it's people like me who hear these stories our entire lives, and have the family lore, that informs our initial political motivations. But now I've come to like demystify a lot of the stories I've heard for so long. And like Russell Means was the first. Russell Means is my great uncle. So the very first person we saw, Russell Means, and then like the photo for the episode on the right, with the red on his hat, that's my great uncle David Swallow. And so very close to this topic. And like Russell is not a great guy. Like, actually, speaking of these two people, funny enough, one of my favorite stories to tell is my uncle David was putting on a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, like a traditional version of Thanksgiving dinner, so people didn't have to go to the churches, right? It gave Lakota people a place that wasn't dictated by a colonial state, right? And so Russell, because he takes such a big pride in the National Day of Mourning, which we'll get into. Remember that. But he goes down there because they live, 10 minutes from each other, right? 5 minutes. It's very easy to get there. We take palms from their ranch all the time, but pine palms. He goes and flips over the table, ruins the whole thing, and then people just go off to the churches, right? And it's like, why would you like infight with your own people because they're feeding people on this day who need to be fed? Like, I get participating in a fast for a political reason, is an okay way to stand in solidarity, I guess, but people need to be fed too, because food's not easy to get there and it's really expensive. Like during COVID, bread was like $15 a loaf. I was out there, it was Hawaii prices, like it. I cannot explain enough how much more expensive it is to live there. Everything's super far. My reservation is Pine Ridge, which is where Wounded Knee is, and Pine Ridge is the size of Connecticut. And go look at the population. I couldn't tell you offhand, that's a lot of people in a very small amount of people in a very large area, and that's one reservation. There's another reservation right next door called Rosebud, and then you have Cheyenne River. These are all similar sizes, but they even used to be even bigger. And so all this gets down to like the 1968 Fort Laramie Treaty that established a Lakota Nation and its borders. Very specifically, it spanned across like 4 or 5 states. I'd have to look at the map and count, but like all the way down to the Platte River in Nebraska, and then all the way up into North Dakota, and then into Montana, and then maybe Colorado. I don't know. I'd have to look at the map, but it's huge. It's the size of Montana, actually, this nation. And it's codified in treaty law. Treaty law is supposed to be held at the same level as the Constitution. And we just ignore treaties, So it's very important to understand these topics because they play right into why these, national parties aren't addressing it. And it's a failure to actually look at the full picture of what we're looking at and the material conditions that actually inform it, and levers we can pull and push that have been successful in the past and have been successful recently in these exact same lands. We can look at the 2016 NoDAPL protests, and you can see one of the largest gatherings of people. It was nonviolent, which good, right? But for legal purposes, but it's a very big point to say that it was nonviolent because like organizers like Red Fawn, who was like a family friend when we lived in Denver, I guess. Like I didn't meet her, but I guess she was at my mom's wedding or something. But she was dating a honeypot, and he planted a gun on her, and then she served time for that, and it's like, we'll get into all this history as the questions continue, but like it's kind of confusing because this is what I organize around and study and have gone across the country learning not only about that, but how it relates to other groups in the area, when I happen to be studying a specific thing. And I'm like, are you aware that this even happened? 90% of the time they're not, and then I was like, well, maybe look into it. But it's a pleasure,
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Let's get into it. What were some of the, events, sort of material relations or conditions that led to AIM being founded?
Well, as I've already mentioned, you have like the 1968 Fort Laramie Treaty, and that's important due to its use in many different groups like AIM at the time, Red Power groups, we call them. Their use of this treaty and the laws surrounding it towards their organizing ends, right? So like the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz happens a year after AIM is founded, so it's not technically part of the onus, but there's an even earlier one that occurs along the same time as the Pasquale fishing wars, and so and if you don't know about that, in the Pacific Northwest, cops were arresting Native people for practicing treaty rights all the time. Same things were happening in the Walleye Wars over here in the Midwest. Like there was literal murders happening about this shit. White people would drive around with bumper stickers that said, "Save a deer, kill an Indian, save a fish, spear an Indian." Like wild stuff. And nobody really talks about it. Nobody really wants to talk about anti-Native racism a lot of times. Like there's a bar that I sell tamales in, and every time I go in there, they have old Westerns on the TV, and I'll just look up and I see red face. Nobody's going to talk about that. But yeah, so like the conditions are 500 years old. When Columbus came here, that's where we have to start to look on why AIM comes about, because we're Marxists. Or at least I hope you are if you're listening. But, we're looking at this from a dialectical and historical materials perspective of how did we get here? And it starts all the way back at Columbus. And then you have to go into like the advent of mercantilism. Columbus was kind of like a doomsayer theorist that wanted to colonize Palestine quicker, basically. Very fascinating, but the Reconquista, like there's a lot of in-depth history. And then why does the Reconquista come about? So like it's a lot of history, and we're going to limit ourselves, right, to like the last, 200 American history. Let's just stick to the American history, right? And we'll also ebb and flow back to the origins and material conditions that lead up to it, because sometimes it's not relevant to bring up the historical backing until we get to that point of the story that it is relevant, right? And so bear with me as I do a sort of oral history style of presentation for you. But this is kind of like a synopsized version of this documentary I was talking about at the beginning that I'm making. So here's my first work through of the thought. And it's not really my first, but a big thing is prisons. What are prisons? What role do they serve? And this is controversial because a lot of people believe in prison slavery, which isn't necessarily not true in the sense of wage slavery, right? But it's much more complex than that. Like labor in prison is a privilege. Most laborers in prison are white. the good jobs are definitely given to the whites. Like there is at the very core of prison is a white supremacist structure that is enforced through systemic efforts to create a self-participatory oppression, right? The inmates help maintain this order too, and it's sort of how the structure was set up and exasperated to in order to prevent things like Attica, right? And so at this time, you do like Attica is around the same period, like there's a lot of going on with the Black civil rights movement and natives since 1923 when we were forced to have citizenship. We obviously weren't being afforded the same rights. We weren't allowed to join the unions. Like all these same things that are happening to New African folk are also happening to us, and we start to see Black nationalist groups organizing themselves towards change and start to model our behavior after that. And so you see a lot of different groups popping up at that time. So you have like the International Indian Brotherhood, you have the Native American Congress. There's a couple different groups that are pretty major people's lexicon, but you also have AIM coming out of this period, and they come out of the prison specifically. A lot of people will say, well, it's 1968 in Minneapolis because of Ojibwe warrior saying that, and Dennis Banks claiming, this is when it starts. But in reality, it starts as a study group, a cultural study group within the walls of the prison and organizing towards religious rights for Native prisoners. So because of this initial study group, we get Native American studies. Like if we're actually asking, where does Native American studies come from? It comes from Stillwater Prison in Minnesota, made by the inmates themselves. And so what happens is there's a lot of residential schools and like child kidnapping going on, and like several young men who come to form AIM at the beginning all end up in prison together, and they start studying together. They create bonds with each other, and when they get outside, they want to organize towards change because they saw what people were doing with like the Black Panthers. Dennis Banks directly quotes them as a source of inspiration, but it was Clyde Bellecourt and Eddie and Benet who formed this initial group. And the way they get into prison is just they were a lifetime of incarceration since they were children. They have been put into an institution ran by the state and punished carcerally. Eddie ends up in prison for pushing a white guy off a Native woman he was trying to like push into a car. What the circumstances surrounding that doesn't matter. You see a white guy pushing a Native woman into the car, try to help, because we can see today with the MMIW issue, thousands of indigenous women go missing. Thousands of indigenous people, but like indigenous man back then should definitely have stepped in that circumstance. And he then goes to prison because the dude hits his head on the curb and dies of a brain hemorrhage. So he gets manslaughter. Dennis Banks is in there because he stole groceries for his large family of 9, and then his footprints in the snow led right back to his place. He was just trying to eat. And yeah, I mean, the circumstances that brought them there don't really matter, but it also speaks to like the extreme poverty. What we have is this mass transfer of Native people through bribery, essentially, and lies. It's not even real bribery. It's lying. They promise like jobs and housing and blah, 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 blah. But really they promise the opportunity for jobs and housing and blah, blah, blah. And so they start to pay people to leave the reservation and go to these huge city centers. So like Cleveland, Denver, Seattle, Portland, like these all become like known for being, I forget the term. It's in my notes somewhere, but it ends up being like these mass transfer. Like my grandma participated in it, like where they took people off the reservation and then were able to take more land. So it's a sophisticated way to steal land in a more modern period. Like land theft didn't stop, in 1890 or whatever people imagine the closure of the frontier looks like. It's never closed as long as reservations exist. There is still land not being totally occupied by the U.S. state that has more freedom of movement of the commons than outside. And so it's a very important condition to understand when organizing, because there's these little pockets of different rules of the law, and yes, at any time the federal government can go in there. Okay. But as we'll learn with the 1973 occupation, if you know the land better, you can do incredible things and stand up to an impossible force through guerrilla tactics, even in the worst spot ever. Just, they weren't really trying to occupy it. It's a very confusing situation. But yeah, we'll get into it. So these are the conditions leading up to the formation of AIM, and it starts because these men are in prison due to poverty, and that's a very rings to all of our ears, I hope, of many other revolutionaries and or would-be revolutionaries efforts and how they became radicalized, right? And so when they get back to Minneapolis, Stillwater is right there, right? So when they go back to Minneapolis, they start organizing amongst Native people in their own groups, and eventually George Mitchell and Dennis Banks call together like a unity meeting between Native groups to try to what's it called? Coalition? I don't know, but build something different. And I forget the name of the woman who suggested the name AIM, but I believe it's Dennis in his book recalls the story of her saying, well, you're always aiming to do this and you're always aiming to do that. Why don't you just call yourself AIM? Because the first suggestion was like citizens, like Concerned Indian Alliance or something like that, but it's spelled CIA. That doesn't, they're like, wait, we needed a different suggestion. Somebody said AIM. So then they're American Indian Movement. That's great. And then they start, at that meeting, Dennis says, well, let's meet back and decide what we're going to do. And Clyde stands up and he's like, well, fuck no, why don't we go do something right now? All of us are here, and they start what's called the Red Car Patrol, which they took video cameras and spray painted a car red, and then would watch cops as they participated in this weekly practice, I should say, of arresting natives at the Indian bars, because segregation, the cops would come in at 9:00 on the dot. You could set your watch to it, literally. They'd come in and they'd have the van parked in the back, and they'd come in and start beating the shit out of patrons and arresting them on drunken disorderly, whether they were or not, did not matter. And they'd push them into the vans in the back like a classic kettle style, and would keep them over the weekend to do like community service, like clean up parks and stuff, and use them as a slave labor force, essentially. Yeah, that's happening in the 60s. Minnesota.
It's interesting. It's sparking memory, because I've seen documentaries, I've read books on AIM. The Red Car Patrol, it's interesting how that seems to be like a first tactic for a lot of like community self-defense groups, is just like patrolling the police. Like, let's just see what they're doing. Like, let's just watch what they're doing, basically. Make sure they're not doing anything too egregious to our community. That's starting here in LA. We have these car patrols going around and watching ICE. Like, that's a big thing now. It's just intriguing how that's a similar thing. The Black Panthers, obviously, that's one of the first things they did, is community patrols of police. Just fascinating sort of thread line through organizing that we see. In terms of, you mentioned the car patrols, but we get to eventually, occupations of Alcatraz, occupations, obviously, of Wounded Knee. I
got a number for you. Between 1969 and 1975, there are 71 Red Power occupations. Most people can name 4.
Yeah, and I remember seeing documentaries of them like occupying universities, occupying municipal buildings. Like it was a very common tactic. How quickly do we get to that becoming the tactic, and what was the sort of strategy behind it?
I mean, at the very core, it's land back. You know, and these are arguments that were coming up in congressional hearings in the 1920s amongst natives and arguing for our rights and to not steal our children. Uh, and so, hold on,
No worries.
I'm fixing my screen. But where was I? I got distracted.
The ramp up to occupations. What was the strategy behind it? And you started talking about land back.
Oh yes, at the very essence, it's land back. It's a return of land, organized around legal principles. So it's actually totally legal for these things to happen due to a law that says any unused federal land is to be returned to the local native tribe. You know, and that's all related to Fort Laramie stuff. When that starts happening, it's literally the next year. They go to the occupation of Alcatraz. Well, and this is inspired a lot by the fishing rights struggle, where they were doing like fish-ins, much like a sit-in. You know, like people were all going on like the Capitol Lake and boats and stuff. And like I have pictures of bridges being set on fire and a lot of stuff. It was wild. It was a wild time. And by 1969, after like AIM's first foray into this strategy, right? There were AIM members at these other struggles I'm talking about, but AIM as like an actual organization sends delegates to the Alcatraz occupation that was started by Richard Oakes and other students like Lenata Warjack, and they were modeling themselves after a group of Lakota people who went out there, well, Chete Shakowin, I should say, who went out there and stood there for like 13 hours in occupation. But Alcatraz aimed to do it longer. They did years, actually. Technically 3 years if you look at like the date, but it's like the end of 1 year and like the beginning. So it's like a year and a half, right? But it begins with Richard Oakes, and you should really look it up. It's addressed to like the Great White Father and all of his people, which is like a common way of addressing the U.S. government in like treaty law and stuff. And so like they do this huge play on the deals made. So like they're like, oh, we'll give you some beads and red cloth, the same you paid for Manhattan for this island. We think it's exactly like in a native reservation. There's no running water, there's no jobs, you can't grow anything. And they list off the issues for you, you know. And they're like, here we want to build a Statue of Liberty that truly shows what being American means, at least to the people who they now occupy. And so it'll show the conditions that natives still find a way to thrive in, you know. And so they aim to make a university there. And Credence Clearwater Revival donates a boat. Weird. There's a lot of different stuff. There's a pirate ship that like takes them out initially. Like Richard Oakes jumps off the side of a pirate ship, swims over there. And so like what's very interesting to me is where people commonly died swimming away from the island, somebody lived swimming to it, you know. Just poetically beautiful there. And you know, they come back under the cover of night and they hide, and then in the morning they kick the dudes off and they claim the island is theirs. And so there's like a radio station that comes out of the what's Pacifica Radio, is that their name? KPFA?
Yes, I believe so. I believe it's Pacifica.
Okay. Yeah, so they help set up a radio show with John Trudell. And so that's like where we see John Trudell get introduced to the story, you know, like if we're looking at it from a historiography perspective. But AIM sees this and they take it back with them to Minneapolis, and they occupy Fort Snelling in 1970. And then in like 1971, you have the occupation of the Winter Dam, which is like I mean, today when we look at like the Klamath Dam removals, right? This is the legacy. You know what I mean? Like, this is like, it all goes back to, you know, then. And they were just supporting Native people in a struggle that they just needed, you know, a more militant attitude towards it. And so they start taking guns to these places. They start, you know, vandalizing, you know, they participate in many different strategies that are more for show, you know, and it works. They're dressed the part, you know. They one of my uncles, and you know, if you meet him, you'll be like, that's a native. That guy is native as fuck. And he goes, yeah, when my little brother came back with my dad and they were down in Pine Ridge, he said, there's real Indians out there. It's like, you are a real Indian. What do you mean? But yeah, so they dressed the part, you know, they looked like what the media wants to present. It was a little bit of a pageant, right? To get the issue out there, get attention on stuff. And so like with Fort Snelling, it's a very brief occupation of an old Navy base that was mostly used like in the War of 1812 and shit. Like, when there was naval battles on Lake Superior. Like, that's crazy, right? I don't know. That's one of those things that I'm like, wait, what? But yeah, so like they occupy a Navy base. They occupy there was an occupation of a Nike missile site. Like, there's so many interesting 71, like I said, from well, and obviously not all 71 happens in this first 2 years or whatever, but by 1970 there's the National Day of Mourning, like I mentioned, right? And so there's a group in New England that was called NACOB at the time, the Native American Indian Council. The New England American Indian Council of Boston or something like that. Anyway, they're now UAIN, United American Indians of New England, and they're putting on this protest because this man Wamsunta Frank James, he was invited to give this speech at this. It was like a bicentennial celebration of the Mayflower. So they built a Mayflower replica that was going to set sail and come into port, blah, 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 blah. And they wanted an Indian to come give a little show, you know, look at us, pilgrims and Indians, just like back in the old times, you know, that kind of deal. And so he's like, you know, the pre-screening gives his speech and like, nah, dude, you can't say that. You're gonna make every white person here feel guilty, you know. And so he's like, well, fuck you. I'm gonna go do my own thing then. And so they plan this National Day of Mourning, invite AIM to come help. They have this plan where the grassroots people are gonna pour the paint over the flag. At some point, Russell Means decides it's gonna be him, you know, and then that's the image, is Russell pouring it over there. And so because of that, you know, he has this huge through line where he's flipping my uncle's fucking dinner over, you know, like, I don't know. That's one of those things while I was studying this, I'm like, I'm weirdly close to this story. You know, and so, you know, what we come to find is this is where we're starting to see this male chauvinism, right? This unchallenged male chauvinism that becomes rampant and a huge issue. At one point, you know, there's an FBI agent pretending to be Native and becomes the head of security for AIM, right? And he's beating his girlfriend and stuff, and like people aren't doing anything about it. And then she ends up dead on the side of the road, strangely enough. Yeah, so it's you know, it's a huge issue to this day. You know, to this day, I can tell you about many different stories of misogyny amongst AIM people, and it's sad, and it's something that needs to be ruthlessly challenged and understood. You know, and so yeah, so we have these, you know, dudes dressed the part, they're men, and they take all, like, everybody just thinks about them. So this group starts getting called New England AIM. They're not AIM. It's a whole other group, and so we start to see the American Indian movement become synonymous with the term the Red Power movement. So, like, if you're being a serious historian, Red Power movement is generally what people are talking about when they briefly skim over AIM, but when we're talking about AIM specifically, we have this organization that is good at getting attention, right? And yeah, occupations fucking do that. But soon they move on to join the Trail of Broken Treaties, and it was controversial whether they could join or not, right? A lot of it was headed by like Hank Adams, Vine Deloria Jr., and like the National Congress of American Indians and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of different groups that are like liberal and way more serious that thought these occupational tactics were way too radical, would catch the ire of the U.S. government, blah 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 blah. But they're planning this cross country caravan, and like groups from Canada are coming down and stuff, but from San Francisco to Washington D.C., and it's called the Trail of Broken Treaties. That's what it becomes known as. There was also a really long, ridiculous name. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there's an episode I did with Nick Estes forever ago where we make a joke about it. Like, imagine that on a bumper sticker, very funny. But this caravan stops in Minneapolis, and this Congress is formed where they develop what's called the 20 points of the Trail of Broken Treaties that basically lay out the bare minimum concessions that need to be made in order for healing to start, like reconciliation to begin. And this is, of course, before the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and stuff. But like, this is like part of the onus of it, is groups like this coming and doing these huge nationally publicized things that when they get there, right, they were promised housing, meetings, blah, 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 blah. And then they just get, I don't know what the word is, stonewalled by the Nixon administration, and end up sleeping in like churches with like rats in the basement, and there's women and children and like elderly people, and like, you need heating, a bunch of different issues with making people sleep in the basement after they came across the entire country. So they go into the BIA and they're like, hey, the fuck, and then they just don't leave. Like, it wasn't supposed to be an occupation. There was no real strategy to it, but they just stay, right? And they just keep coming in, and they keep coming in. And, eventually it's like, there's too many of us for you to do anything, and so then they kick people out. There's a picture of them putting a guy in a headlock. It's fucking awesome. But the DC police start hiring people real quick to get like a show of force, right? And the Black Panthers take those jobs, and we're like, dude, don't worry. Most of us are Black Panthers. We're not going to do anything. We're just taking their money, genius. And then they're like, hey, you want like dynamite? And so they say no, but instead they come up with this plan to pour gasoline and like major points. And like, when asked about it from the news, they're like, well, let's just say we're smoking cigarettes on the roof now. But yeah, so then they cause millions of dollars in damages. And then my favorite thing is they steal like 3 tons of like cabinets full of fucking files on like land theft and like stealing money and shit from the trusts of tribes and shit. It's very fat. Like, these are documents that to this day can be read and are in the hands of very specific groups, because they all went back to the tribes they were supposed to go with, because this is a caravan, right? And so like, at the end of this, they're like loading this shit up. They're like, keep it on the down low. And then they get a briefcase full of money from the Nixon administration, which is the most Nixon thing to do. Here's a briefcase, get the fuck out of here. And so they're just handing out that cash, dude. They're just, and then it's all gone. And there's not enough for everybody to get it, because they were not, being diligent with budgeting. They're like, how much do you think you need? Here you go. you know, but everybody ends up getting home one way or another. And uh, these documents, like to this day, still exist and can be read. And that's why you should get to know local peoples, because you might get to meet somebody who has knowledge of these things. And it's kind of like an interesting piece of history to be able to look at, you know. But what we see here is this occupation is primarily galvanized around like martyrs of the movement, which would be like Raymond Yellow Thunder, who's killed by this white supremacist summer camp counselor, and like whether he picked the fight with the guy or not doesn't matter. He's murdered by a white supremacist. Okay. And then the murder of Raymond Yellow Thunder in 1972, which is obviously after this Washington, D.C. Incident. I don't know. That's not the right word. But yeah, 1972, the murder of Raymond Yellow Thunder plays into this same dynamic, right? And Raymond Yellow Thunder was a native who frequented the liquor store in Gordon, Nebraska. And Gordon set up their stuff, their liquor stores, so it's the closest to the reservation, so natives can come in and then leave and not go into the town. You know, that's how it's supposed to be done. You know, that's like the unwritten rule. Well, not, I mean, it's written in blood, but, you know, and so a common thing is called Indian rolling. It's where you beat the shit out of an Indian person for being Indian. This happens to this day. Okay. I have been Indian rolled, you know, and now we have cowboy rolling, where you beat the shit out of a white guy for being a white guy. You know? 1, 2. But what happens is these ranch hands beat the shit out of this guy, and he dies due to hemorrhaging in the brain and stuff after being made to dance naked in American Legion Hall while cigarettes are put out on him and stuff. And then he's beaten the fuck out of, and then he dies in a car that he sleeps in a junkyard. And that's unfortunately a reality for many deaths that way. And the American Indian movement would burn down like White Clay, Nebraska for these same kind of issues in the 90s. You know, so like a lot of feelings. Like it's hard to keep my composure when talking about this exact thing, because the AIM song that is like known, it's the one that goes, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey. That one's called the Raymond Yellow Thunder song, actually. And so it's to him. And it's, you know, every AIM meeting starts with that. If you have a meeting of AIM peoples, you start with that. And that's something I grew up, you know, instilled in me. You know, I can sing that entire song. It's the first song you learn, you know. It's really important when talking about this and the organizing I do. And, you know, his murder and then the later murder of Wesley Badhart Bull will lead up to the famous Wounded Knee occupation 1973. But first, we're going to have the Custer riots, where they burned down the Custer courthouse. It's a pretty interesting fucking thing, because I have it on video. I have like a bunch of archive videos that I have some friends in the Pacific Northwest that were part of the Video Freak movement, which was like a bunch of upwardly mobile middle-class white people with video cameras that would go to civil rights movements and film them, you know. And they have like terabytes of 15 millimeter fucking tape in a barn in this little hippie compound in Washington. One of the weirdest trips of my life.
That's like my heaven. I want you to know that. Like, that's like,
oh, it's beautiful like, too.
Oh, okay.
It's right next to the Columbus River. So like every morning you're just hearing it rush. And then it's like under these mountains of an old growth forest they saved back in the 70s. The weirdest thing, though, is dude has like a dreadlock in his beard that the Dalai Lama did their 7th time hanging out with him. And he has it to this day.
There's a lot there, a lot going on there, man. Oof.
I sound crazy sometimes. Okay, not to be stated, but like I feel not okay when I recount my life over the last 5 years. and I've done it very cheaply, is what blows my mind. Like I I made $15,000 go a long fucking way, let me tell you. So yeah, like this is a very complicated story with a lot of ins and outs, as you can see, and a lot of it plays into my real life that I've experienced. But like, I have this video of the Custer riots when they burned down the courthouse, and somebody like throws a flare into the building after like a bunch of gas is poured, and then that doesn't work. So you have like people like flicking their cigarettes and shit. And so like, one of the things when I started this was like, who started the fire? Was you like a Fed? Because okay, we'll get into it. But who started the fire? And I watched this video finally like 3 years into the project. I'm like, everyone tried, you know. There's not one specific person. Everyone tried. And there's this whole movie, I forget who did it. I think it was like Jane Fonda even. But which, by the way, Jane Fonda and Ted, whatever her husband's name is, freaking they sweat lodged with my uncles. I don't know. Iggy Azalea did too.
Like, there's why? a lot going on here that I'm trying to.
Why people be weird. But yeah, so like Stephen Fry, that dude, like my uncle had to drive him home naked one time. Yeah. But yeah, so very interesting connections. But yeah, in the movie they have this guy in like a white coat that disappears and like leaves his baby mama on the res or whatever, and that's like a common issue, right? It's like these AIM dudes came, they took advantage of a lot of people and then leave, never to be seen again. And now we just deal with the aftermath of Wounded Knee and stuff. And not only that, like you have like the testing of like Agent Orange on the reservation at the time. So there's like a considered effort to destroy traditional food structures because they're located in like the riverbeds, which happen to be where the traditional people were seated in like their places of power, if you will. That these food forests, for lack of a better term, would provide for the people in harsh times. And so like dam projects, like there's the Pick Sloan plan, which builds several dams across the plains area that are, their position is placed specifically to kill Indian people. There are recorded arguments in Congress, like in about where to place them. And they're like, well, if the flooding happens downriver, like, yeah, but if we put it upriver, we'll kill those people and be able to take their land. And not even all of it, like they flood huge portions of the land that are very fertile. They're very productive. Why? Genocide. It's literally a hindrance to the progress of history. And that's why I don't believe that like the American Revolution is historically progressive. Constantly throughout all of American history, we have this considered effort that puts things back worse. Not that it doesn't make more productive forces, it actually kills them. Those are some conditions I left out, and plays into like why trade unionism like always goes into reaction here, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. That's why I'm bringing it up. But this all leads to like a culmination of bad events, right? And so somebody has a vision about a bad storm that's coming and stuff, and so there's like this flood that happens in Rapid City that wipes out the the Indian ghettos essentially. And AIM is like right there, that's where they're organizing. There's this place called the Mother Butler Center that they were famous for using. And it all culminates perfectly that like Wounded Knee is going to happen. And so like, they're like, we need, people to come out here, look at this shit and see what's happening. And to make it all worse, there's this guy who comes in power on Pine Ridge named Richard Wilson, Dick Wilson. And Dick Wilson is essentially like a gangsterismo-esque warlord who gets armed by the U.S. and with armor-piercing rounds to shoot at bunkers and stuff in a church because to protest these conditions, AIM ends up going to Wounded Knee to pray, and then the goon. Oh yeah, his paramilitary group was called the Goon Squad, the Guardians of the Oglala Nation. But he, everybody would call them goons, and then they just embraced it and came up with that acronym post hoc. So it's like, it just playing the part really well, right? And he sets up these blockades and stuff that they can't leave, so they set up there. And much like the BIA, it's like an unplanned thing. Like a lot of people say it was more planned than it was. There was the majority of people were not supposed to go there. There was a nightfall effort to disconnect the trading posts, there's phones and stuff, and stop them from arming the Hamlet, because there's a lot of guns there. Like a shit ton of guns, and then like they were known for like ripping off natives, and like taking on like massive debt, company store type shit. You know what I mean? And so they planned they planned like a prayer thing there that wasn't supposed to be like this huge occupation, and they expected white violence to be reactive, right? Which is what we saw in like Gordon when they protested Raymond Yellow Thunder's murder. Like the entire town like stayed indoors, and then like there was like cops with guns like on roofs and shit, and like just staring at them as they marched through the town. Like nobody would come and confront. It was very interesting, but they were waiting for like a gunman to shoot and something because of like Custer they burned down, and so everybody thinks they're going to burn down more shit, blah 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 blah. But like the 12 people who stayed, like the story goes that there was 12 hostages, but it's 12 people who chose to stay because they're like, no, you're right, the government fucked you guys over, here I am just profiting off of it, we're going to stand with you, and so they stayed, so the fucking feds wouldn't come in and just kill everybody, which it's like, like when there's this, well, you're going to preclude 60% of the population, and it's like 60% of white people are not going to side with the white supremacists unless they're in power and able to kill them easily. Like that's right now we have an opportunity. Once it's full fascism, I expect a lot of little Eichmann. But even then, like it's like how much of Nazi Germany was SS officers, like who are like the true hardcore believers is like the MAGA crowd. That's why I don't think appealing to them is going to work very well. But even then, it's very easy to get MAGA people to side with native issues. And then that causes cognitive dissonance between two sets of beliefs where they're like, no, you are right. Sovereignty is important. Your sovereignty is being trampled on. I'm like, yeah, dude. So you should be a communist. That's when they're like, what? It's like self-determination. It's a way better word. But it's a very complicated situation that it's just a buildup of issues. You can see, like, I mean, when we get down to like the boarding school issue, the government said it's to hold in good behavior the ward populations or something like that about children, like they're hostages. They are literally hostages. That's how Congress viewed it in the residential schools. And at those early land back, discussions with the government, at the end of it, once they signed away our rights and became citizens, basically, I mean, that's not really what happened, but that's, the feeling of what happened. The first thing said was, can we see our children now? Because they were being taken all the way to Pennsylvania at the time, to Carlisle. And I've been to Carlisle. I know how to identify children's bodies through LiDAR, like that. I learned that at 21. It's sad. It's really sad to be able to go across the country and then look at residential schools and boarding schools and go, oh, that's where they buried them, huh? You know, like it's like my aunt was in boarding school. Like they locked her in a basement for being bad and made her sleep there overnight and stuff. Like it, and in that same basement, the story goes, that's where they'd burn bodies. You know, at a certain point, they just started burning bodies. Go on.
On the topic of boarding schools, I know that wasn't the list of questions I gave you, but you know, you brought up, you know, this factor, and it's something that, you know, I when I read, you know, history, so to speak, from Indigenous historians and such, that's a common thing that's brought up, obviously, in U.S. history, but it's something that seemingly not in like the social zeitgeist like it is in Canada. Like Canada seems to be going through that contradiction very publicly, at least, in terms of the boarding school genocide that happened there. And obviously that 100% happened here in the US on a much larger scale, for being quite honest. And it seems to like not be a thing that's socially talked about, even amongst like left groups. And I'm just wondering, do you have an idea of like why there's that huge disconnect? Why it's seemingly such a public conversation in Canada, but not in the U.S.?
Well, in 2014, Canada was found guilty of genocide for the sterilization of Indigenous women. And that sparked their truth and reconciliation issues. And we have yet to have that. The closest we have is the 90s agreement between the nation of Hawaii and the U.S., where they admit that they committed genocide. And that's the closest we've ever got to the U.S. officially going, yep, that was systemic murder. You know? So like that's primarily why. And in Hawaii, you have a deeper conversation, a more robust conversation, you know, like in places that are more natively popular, like where I live, there is a larger native population. I live like near like 4 different reservations, you know. Here, like we had like a books that we would read about boarding school escapes and stuff. Like we had a considerable curriculum that actually kind of tried to talk about that. But like when we look at California, Native Americans didn't exist in the history books until like the 80s. At that point, we just left. We just left California. Nah, too crowded, dude. Going to Texas. And so like you know, it's only recently that people want to even like admit natives are still alive. Like I've been asked to my face, I thought all your people were dead. I'm like, well, I'm fucking right here, and I have a mom, don't I? She has parents. Like, what do you mean, dude? My name's Sungmanitu. I don't know. Not a lot of folks with that name, let me tell you. And so like it's very you know, it's this erasure, like a part of the genocidal project is to out of sight, out of mind us. So for a long time we were put on reservations. We weren't allowed to leave. Up till like the 90s, we had to be back by like 10 o'clock or we could be arrested and then fucking put in jail, you know, like for being out past curfew, you know, as adults. You know, there's like this constant paternalism, and so like there's this invisibility that goes on, right, where the erasure becomes so systemic, so naturalized that people just they never think about natives. You know, when we're talking about Black issues, like you can look at native statistics in native dominated areas. We have overrepresentation over Black populations of prison service, you know, like it's like it's based on where we're concentrated, of course, you know, but like if you go per capita, you start to see the same issues happening, if not worse, you know. And it's not like a competition or anything. It's that this is the future. This is the autogenocidal project goal, is to, you know, subdue the colonized nations ability to stand up. You know, we need to be kept down as long as possible. That's why, you know, they don't give us tractors, you know, they don't give us seeds. We just now have an irrigation pipeline, and most people's connection to it is not to garden. They're drinking irrigation water. That's not healthy if you didn't know that, but that's the only running water on my reservation. Like, and then it's a $10,000 hookup to be poisoned, like, so like a lot of people still use wells if you're lucky enough to have one, and or if it didn't freeze over winter, very cold place, or they go down to the creek or the river that they live closest to. Sometimes it's miles of walking. It's third world living conditions here in the United States, and most people can't even speak to it. They're not aware. We had people from Guatemala with the group Kotica come to Pine Ridge, and they said, "Wow, you're poorer than us." You never know what to say to people when they say that to you, because you're like, oh, really?
You mentioned earlier in the show the fact that I think it was either your oil or your natural gas used to come from Venezuela, right? And then sanctions came in and sort of restricted that access. Is that a common occurrence for reservations to be sort of restricted by the federal government from international access to infrastructure materials, all this sort of stuff that you would need to build up a community, so to speak, right?
100%, and that's why it's been so controversial that the Belt and Road Initiative is being discussed between Canadian Indigenous groups and China. It's very controversial for us to have any outside investment of a national scale instead of just private equity, charitably doing whatever it supports the underlying superstructures, right, that are coming to dominate what's left of like a Lakota superstructure. It's very interesting to see where the bleed throughs are or not, but you can definitely see that the proletarianization or lumpenization, either or, is definitely going along incredibly quickly comparatively to like the amount of time it took to get there. And for us it's later to the game, obviously. Like we have a considerable amount of independence up into like 1890, where we're able to like have a whole nother fucking war with the US government after already having a war where we have a settled nation with them and peace treaty because we won that war. And then the Black Hills War, when they started breaking that treaty, leads up to like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and that's like the period most people are aware of. The first war is Red Cloud's War, and so Red Cloud goes around this entire watershed. It's basically the Missouri watershed, and defines it based on the furthest shoreline. So the whole river and the shoreline over there is ours. Is that how the treaty was written. And it's because it's important to be able to control that level of ecosystem for the prosperity of whatever is living there, not just humans. Like, it was about preserving buffalo herds, which the mass extinction of doesn't happen until the 1900s, right? Like the final solution level of massacring buffaloes is not happening until we're already on the reservation and we're putting up too much of a fight while on that reservation. Okay. And so like the US government assassinates Sitting Bull. And so then Spotted Elk comes down, often called Bigfoot. So like the highway I always drive is called the Bigfoot Memorial Highway. And I'm always on that path he walked from Rapid City. Like when I come from Rapid City to my reservation, I literally go down this path every time I'm there and relive this journey of genocide. It's a lot of weight on somebody's head, like to be that engrossed in like history. Like I come from Michigan to South Dakota and I drive through Stillwater. I go through Minneapolis. I go to St. Paul. I go and see this history we're talking about right now, just to go home, And so like, it's interesting to say the least. I don't know exactly where I wanted to go with that, but it's a lot of context that's important to what we're discussing with the Wounded Knee occupation, because why is this site chosen? Why does it play this importance? You know, like when I'm talking about this place, it's a mass grave site of these people who fled after political assassination of a red nationalist leader, you know, a Lakota nationalist leader who was, to this day, is one of the most studied guerrilla leaders next to Che Guevara. High honors, you know, in my opinion. So it's and how many communists can tell me about Crazy Horse? You know, he's like, in everyone's eyes, he is considered to the same degree as the guerrilla fighters that we idolized, you know, in 1917, only 27 years after this massacre. You know, in fact, Sitting Bull, one of my favorite quotes to give out, said, "The white man knows how to make everything, but not how to distribute it." And it's like, damn, bro, you read some Marx, you know, that's some good shit. But, so he, you know, it's very relevant to me, because when we're asking what are the conditions we're organizing in, people in South Dakota should know this history. You know, considering that the Ochete stretched all the way to the Mississippi. And that's the larger political structure we're talking about when we're talking about Lakotas. You know, our territories stretched all the way out to the Mississippi, all the way to the Rockies, up into Alberta, down to Texas. You know, that's a huge area. And nobody, you know, knows that we're the last standing, you know, Native Federation. You know, like Lewis and Clark were told explicitly by Thomas Jefferson, make friends with them. And then they try to cheat us, like they try not to pay our toll. And that's the big reason why people start taking this this by sea journey to the West Coast. They're not crossing the plains. It's because we're enacting tolls, or the Comanche are murdering them. You know, those are your two choices: pay up, or we'll murder you, or just die to the Comanche. There is no toll, you know, or you go to Mexico, walk across, sail back. You know, and so that's how it happens, is they enclose us around. And so like we start to see people come through and they never come back. You know, nobody ever came back until the railroad, and then the railroad sets up these guns as like a promotion, like a game to play while you're bored on the train, to just shoot buffalo while you drive through. And then it's still to this day cheaper to ship by sea. So the Transcontinental Railroad basically did nothing until like high-speed rails became a thing, and it's not a high-speed rail. So
no, and I want to say, if I remember reading correctly, like they specifically made it cut through indigenous land for the purpose of like displacing them and then trying to buy that land, right? Like creating the conditions to where you would need to sell the land. Right, like that was a purpose of the Transcontinental Railroad, 100%. Let alone, you know, the economic reasons or whatever, connecting the coast, whatever bullshit manifest destiny.
Well, that's just the propaganda. Like around this same time, we have like the popularization of bananas and stuff, like the population of the color green. You know, like these are all a part of the same bits of like yellow journalism propaganda that start like the Spanish-American War. You know. And like literally William Randolph Hearst, he was a primary driver as well for the economic want for trains to go through the plains, which would allow settlement to become easier, right? That's why so many settlements sprung up along the railroad, right? In his newspaper, he would like be basically calling us communists. Like literally, like the original Red Scare was about Lakota people so they could steal our land for gold, you know. And so like William Randolph Hearst is heavily invested in, like his family was heavily invested in Black Hills Gold. After, like they started off as slavers and then left America to go to California where slavery was still legal with natives for a very long time. And then they were like,
past the Civil War, like most people don't realize, past the Civil War we had slavery in California, in the US, like full-on chattel slavery that existed.
And so yeah, exactly. And then they're like, what if we start murdering them for gold because we're running out of gold spots over here? where we've already murdered people. And so like we have this very like, it's just the same names in history of like monopolists, but like imperialists. I mean, when we get down to it, these imperialist figures that were great friends with like Teddy Roosevelt and helped him start the Spanish-American War, which leveraged him into his presidential career. Like these same people are the same people orchestrating the genocide of my people, from California. And now we see Stanford fuckers orchestrating genocide in Palestine along with Mossad and stuff, and then we see a deployment of towers tested in Palestine around reservations. Since 2019, they've been putting up towers around reservations like they have around Gaza. If that doesn't tell you what they think is going to happen, you have your head in your fucking ass. You know what I mean? Stop huffing your own farts. Come breathe the fresh air. The fresh air is decolonization. So like, this all these things are built into why Wounded Knee becomes such a symbolic place and provides this level of defense through the optics of, if the government comes in and murders a group of Indians at Wounded Knee, it will be a second mass grave on a mass grave site. And like now, all those original buildings have been torn down. The church no longer exists because the government tore it down, because the line right after Wounded Knee was, we didn't shoot any bullets into the church. Hundreds of bullets were shot into that church, and they fucking burned it down to hide the evidence. All the buildings people were hiding in, they fucking burned it down to act like they weren't the ones shooting. And a lot of it is like they take a picture of an AK-47 that AP News put out. Guy, big old smile on his face, holding up an AK-47. It didn't work. Most of their weapons were bolt-action rifles. They had 13-year-olds armed with guns. They had 7-year-olds helping dig bunkers. I've met them. One of the more interesting things is there's an elderly woman who was a survivor of the original massacre. One of the babies found suckling on her mother's tit at the bottom of a flagpole for peace flag. The mom is murdered. The baby is still breastfeeding. Like it's not that long ago. Great grandfathers of like my uncles rode with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Like these aren't distant figures in our brains. These are people, relatives that lived recently, very recently. And we appreciate how recently, because it hasn't been that long. We've been this oppressed, and we have fought and made many gains. And I think through communist organizing and effort, we could see even more gains and actually see true liberation, and land back. And that's, the symbol that Wounded Knee provides, right? Is this, it's 300 Oglala people standing up to the U.S. government and winning. We won the concessions. The Nixon administration comes like a week or two after. I have the videos of them speaking in Kyle, South Dakota, and at the end, one of the dudes, he's like, "I just want to be clear. It was not because of Wounded Knee we showed up. I just want to be clear. Do not do another one, okay?"
Please don't do that. Please don't do it again. That scared us.
Hilarious little sidebar, dude.
If I can jump around the questions just a little bit.
By all means. I jump around everywhere.
Just because I think it flows better with what you're talking about. So, we have Wounded Knee in 1973. And then I would say the common understanding, even amongst a large section of the left, is that post 73, AIM eventually falls apart and becomes a part of history, similar to the Black Panther Party, right? Like AIM has this sort of historical understanding from people on the left, And, as you've stated at the very top, like AIM is still technically around.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get from, the occupations, the very famous events of the 1970s and late 1960s to today for AIM? How does AIM develop post sort of this historic period?
Well, and so 1973 is sort of like the what's it called, coup de grace of like the story, right? Like it's this huge moment, and you think revolution's around the corner, right? Same thing that happened with the APL, and they don't stop organizing. They organize very heavily, but what we see is this mass amount of repression, and the way this occurs is sort of we have to connect Black Panthers and AIM beyond their just immediate, hey, we'll help each other where we're happen to be in the same spot, right? Like Oakland Black Panthers helped the Alcatraz occupation. In Minneapolis, you had a group called the Soul Patrol that would end up becoming affiliated with the Black Panthers. Like there's a bunch of different examples, but one of the biggest ways they're connected is through the repression they faced. And so with the Black Panthers, we know was the last official group targeted by the COINTELPRO operation that would seek to disrupt communists, Black nationalists, and then end, quote unquote, after anti-war activists raid the FBI headquarters and find these documents that show a conspiracy to disenfranchise members of undesirable political movements, and it ends technically, and the Church Commission comes about because of it. And what we find is these tactics described in the Church Commission are being deployed in 1973 on a larger scale that's more interconnected. Not that these agencies have ever been very disconnected in their operations, but we see the U.S. deploy paramilitary arms, the FBI, the CIA, fucking Marines, the Air Force. Like these are all deployed on the occupation of Wounded Knee. You have flares lighting up the sky all night long. There's all kinds of things that happen. There's even like hearsay about a Marine's death that isn't reported, at Wounded Knee. And so and it's because of how illegal this is. Right, if we become citizens in 1923 and you deny us treaty making, then why the fuck are you deploying Marines on us? That's illegal as fuck. And so we see this guy Douglas Durham be introduced to the story, and Douglas Durham comes from Des Moines, AIM, right? And he was a former cop, is the story he tells. And the story is backed up by a couple newspaper clippings he just happens to have, right? Where one's about him buying rice. And another one comes from The Workshop, the infamous CIA-ran newspaper out of Des Moines. So there's these fake paper stories, like one in like a real newspaper about him buying rice, and then all of a sudden he's caught. He's a security guard at this warehouse, right? And he's caught stealing and selling shit, which is the whole reason he was hired as a security guard, right? And so this guy, he just happens to have a pilot's license, and he's like, Dennis, I got you. Let's go flee. We'll fly up to Canada, chill out up there, and he becomes like best friends with Dennis Smith. They become best friends, and up until like 1975, he is the leader. He's the head of the American Indian Movement's national security. Nobody could talk to Russell Means or Dennis Banks except through him. And then you also have figures like Ward Churchill, which there's a photo of a guy who looks oddly like him coming out of the same helicopters bringing the FBI agents. Ward Churchill would be an instrumental figure alongside Russell Means as he turned towards like the Libertarian Party and running with like Hustler CEO Larry Flint or whatever, and fucking would work for Alex Jones and shit. Like the guy influenced it. Oh, and they tried to smuggle guns to the Contras. The history of AIM starts to get complex after Wounded Knee, because you have like this mass amount of repression where so he's an FBI informant, Douglas Durham, at this point, but he was a former CIA chaos agent. And these are similar programs, COINTELPRO and Chaos. I don't know, and I forget the NSA's program off the top of my head right now, but that's besides the point. Nobody ever talks about that one, and I always try to talk about it because it's not publicized very often. I don't know what notebook it would be in. I have too many notebooks around me at this very moment, and so
Don't worry.
it does not help. But yeah. So anyway, freaking, there's this considerable effort to disrupt what they're doing, and they have eyes inside these personal lawyer discussions between the people they're prosecuting, right? And so Dennis Banks and Russell Means get out of all trouble specifically because of this dynamic becoming revealed, right? They end up discovering Douglas Durham is an agent at the 1975 75 occupation. No, 74. I forget the exact date, but the occupation of the Alexian Brother Novitiate in Gresham, Wisconsin. Again, another place I drive if I want to add 30 minutes to my trip. Boop. And so what happens there is they're digging through his van and they find check stubs. Like hidden in the vinyl of the roof, right? And then very interesting story. But he ends up leaving with that girl I mentioned that ends up being murdered. She's found soon after they're murdered. And then not too long after that, the same car that he drives is the car that's last seen taking Annie Mae Aquash. So it's, like that entire story is very complicated too. Not something I like to get into due to the controversiality, and I'm waiting on a couple people to publish books who are more closely related to this, because Bruce Allison drops her off at the place she's last seen, and then leaves. So Bruce Allison's writing a book on the subject, and then Nick Estes is as well. And so, they have more credentials than me. So let them handle it, but needless to say, there's this huge complex history of what happens after with these court hearings, who goes to jail, because there's still people that are affected by the legal issues that happened back then. Like my grandma was considered a domestic terrorist into the 90s, but what we see is a ton of organizing still, and it's not as flashy as Wounded Knee, because it can't be. Now they're under extreme repression. They don't know it yet, but and the very top brass, FBI agent, and then Ward Churchill has never been confirmed a Fed or anything like that, but it is interesting, what evidence, like he was writing for Soldier of Fortune, a right-wing paramilitary, weird. And then I've talked to him, and he spent hours talking about the War of Northern Aggression. That's how he kept saying it. And I was like, that's loaded, bro. I was texting my producer, what the fuck? Yeah. So interesting conversation, to say the least. But yeah, it's and then he does this this Mr. X thing, right? There's a Mr. X. Oh, hold on. Remind me of Mr. X, because we'll get to that. Okay. And so they start doing smaller scale, more realistic, less flashy things. So they're building community gardens. They're giving talks and lectures for education. They're helping with schools. They start these things called survival schools, which are these beautiful things that last up until the early 2010s, the early aughts. And so but it took students who traditionally only 15% of them will graduate in a classic public school education at the time. And it turned it into an 85% graduation rate by teaching our culture and our history to us. And that's, Michigan happens to have a higher turnout rate of graduation amongst natives. And I contribute that directly to the fact that we do get more education about native issues here than in other places. It's not a lot, but it is better, and it's that little bit that makes people not alienated from the society. Because when you're constantly hearing about the people who murdered your people as good people, you don't feel good, psychologically. You feel very unwanted. You feel different constantly. When your name's Sungmanitu, everyone's like, I got something easier. You're like, oh, I can't even have my name. Like, school took my name from me and made me have a different name. Like that. It's a very weird thing. And like, we got briefly taught about Wounded Knee, and I was like, you need to shut up. Like, he said, what? I was like, this is like my family you're talking. This is all wrong. Like, you're just lying to these kids, dude. Like, you're telling them there's hostages. No, they volunteered to stay, But the next big event is the incident at Oglala, as that famous movie's named. But it's the shooting at the Jumping Bull Ranch, which was a very interesting issue because, again, they're building community gardens, but the government says the potato sellers, the root sellers, are bunkers like at Wounded Knee, right? And then on the maps that they use to get their warrants, they called the Jumping Bull Ranches the Black Elks because the Black Elks were directly involved in Wounded Knee. And so then it would look like they're doing this on somebody who's already supported armed struggle, right? And you have what's called, I forget the exact phrasing, but you have like 5 major laws that allow the federal government to come onto a reservation and like execute warrants and stuff. And that's due to how the sovereignty of like state, federal, and tribal powers work. And it's federal, tribal, and they're actually kind of supposed to be equal to a point, but one's like a paternalistic, and then states can affect the other two, right? And so they use these theft of boots to come down, and it ends up that Joe Stunt's AIM member gets murdered, and then 2 FBI agents end up dead. And when the government likes to talk about this, they don't like to mention Joe Stunts, and it's really sad because, like, I visit his grave a lot, like he shouldn't have died. Like that guy they came looking for is like Jimmy Eagle or something like that. And he wasn't there. He's never there, and then they go chasing after, they give several different vehicles that were supposedly Peltiers, and they go chasing after him. There's like a whole like group ready to ambush that had been coming in since the morning. So it's like this was a planned thing, they were literally planning on raiding this place. And then it went south, and 2 FBI agents get murdered by a gun that Leonard Peltier did not use. Leonard Peltier gets put in prison because they omit the ballistics evidence from the trial in a gun trial. There's no ballistic evidence because then it will show that the gun Leonard Peltier used was not the one that fired the bullets. Well, there's even confession tapes and stuff like the Mr. X thing. And so Mr. X is a person filmed. Oh, I used to know whose house it was filmed in. But anyway, they put on this costume and they get, I'm the one who killed him, blah, 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 blah. And that was Dave Hill, who's also known as the Mount Rushmore bomber. He was arrested. He knew how to make bombs. Marlon Brando once gave them an RV. And Marlon Brando once gave them an RV, and they were smuggling explosives across the country where did Matt go? But they were smuggling explosives across the country, and like later on it becomes that he's accused of trying to blow up Mount Rushmore, never did. And then so he's Mr. X and talks about this stuff, and tries to create this story that's like it's not him, because it isn't Leonard Peltier. But then this makes that reality look bad, and the person who orchestrates this sort of scheme is Ward Churchill. I think it was Ward's house even that it was filmed. I'll have to ask David, but my grandma ends up saving Dave Hill's kid's life from a rattlesnake bite, so like a close family friend, and my grandma ends up being the assistant director or whatever of AIM Security, like after the Durham shit, and so like just very well connected to the story. But like I've talked with these people about it, and it's that's where it ends, like in people's imagination, right? Like that's where, like, not to these people who actually lived it, but in everyone's head, that's where AIM ends, is Leonard Peltier going to prison for shit he didn't do, and he's only now on house arrest. Like that, I mean, he only now sees the outside of the bars. Like he never met his son outside the bars of prison. His son was born after he goes into prison, and his son dies the day before lobbying Obama in the room next door to Nick Estes. Like it's I couldn't imagine the pain, like that's harsh. And so like people are organizing for his freedom. People are organizing, the International Indian Treaty Council, which ends up becoming a huge part of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that was only ratified this century. We have a long-standing history that just gets wiped under these big flashy events, and like this, like it is a nice narrative closure, right? Amen. After this, just fizzles out. But in reality, it keeps going. It fractionalizes, like I said, between a national group, an autonomous group, and then like a women's group, essentially, that kind of just like organized underneath the great men of these two factions as their own faction. And that's kind of a part of like the grassroots. So I kind of call it like four factions essentially that exist to this day. And like the autonomous AIM groups, you start to see like Nazi chapters pop up. Not cool. You see an attempt to make a alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood. One of the dumbest ideas I've ever heard in my life. And that's like a lot of Russell Means and Ward Churchill shit. So Ward Churchill and Russell Means become sort of like the figureheads with Glenn Morris, who's still like the figurehead for Denver, Dakota AIM. But Ward Churchill and Russell specifically were like kind of like the big, like outspoken, until they're ostracized essentially. Russell quits like 7 times, and then like I mentioned, he tries to smuggle guns into to the Contra. Well, it's to a group of Mosquito who were working with the Contras due to failures of the Sandinista to appropriately address those contradictions effectively, right? So like that's one of the big things like people need to be aware of. You can just drive groups into the hands of Nazis very easily if you just don't consider them, in your planning. Like that's one of the biggest issues, and we've seen it happen with the Sandinista. We've seen it happen across the world with revolutions that are affected by the colonial question. Those internal contradictions come to rot out what pillars of revolution exist or were built up, because the foundation's faulty, and that's why I think it's so important to know this history and stuff, is that these are the contradictions the CIA and FBI presses on using people like Ward Churchill and stuff. They'll pretend to be advocates for this specifically so they can push buttons and push people away either to the Nazis, in some form. They want to push them away from the decolonial struggle because it's one that's easily unifiable. It easily unifies a lot of people, and you can see directly with how much it spurred environmentalist momentum, and the environmentalists become the target of the COINTELPRO projects, and only after the environmentalists are basically neutralized do we start to see this huge, they start focusing on fundamentalist Christians, they start, that's when they start to like, oh, well, maybe we should watch them a little bit. Oklahoma City was kind of, and you have groups like the John Birch Society, who like Alex Jones's dad was like a member of. And then Russell Means, the John Birch Society tried to assassinate Russell Means, and then Russell Means works for one of their sons. What? Very confusing, that faction, right? We can all agree. And the smuggling the guns thing comes out of like this secret meeting with Elliot Abrams and Oliver North, like before the Iran-Contra scandal happens. So this is like the precursor to why the Iran-Contra scandal even happens. Very fascinating.
And Russell Means just as a figure is fascinating because then he becomes like a movie star. Like honestly, like that's how I know him is from movies, like so Russell Means fascinating figure. And I kind of want to touch on the sort of political ideological eclecticism within AIM. Did AIM as an organization see itself as fighting against, sort of colonial relations and genocide, and also capitalism, or was capitalism not really a focal point because of this sort of political eclecticism and COINTELPRO infiltrations? Was it not really a focus for AIM?
I wouldn't say it was a focus necessarily. It was more a byproduct of the fact capitalism and colonialism go hand in hand, right? But what's interesting is in National AIM, so that's like the group Dennis Banks and Clyde Bellecourt and Vernon Bellecourt would be like the heads of. Vernon was a communist, like explicit communist, and they had a democratic centralist structure, and they definitely very much were wrestling with the realities of capitalism, sure, but due to their lack of focus, they end up becoming landlords. Not it. So like, it's unfortunate that they had this communist influence, but there was like Tanzania that still allowed people to be like, well, they're doing it differently there, so let's see what happens. And then like there's this repetition of what ends up becoming a failure. I mean, no offense to Tanzania, but like, we don't need Lakota socialism, right? We need socialism that pertains to the conditions specific to Lakota people as well as other people here. Like, does that make sense? Like, it's confusing to say because like I'm also coming from Lakota are only one section of the Ochete Shakowin, which is already a broader political group. So when I look at what socialism with blank characteristics is, I'd say Ochete Shakowin, if anything, right? But like then that's just because of my own frame of reference. I'm not going to say the Anishinaabe people need to act like Ochete Shakowin, insert whatever federations. Can you hear that bell right now?
A little bit, to be honest, but not too bad. It's not too bad. It's not too bad. Don't worry about it. Just keep going. No one's going to pay attention to it. It's okay.
It's just so loud. I'm like, it's dude, holy shit. But so like it's we see a lot of different factions pop up, and like so on the autonomous AIM side, you also have the Oklahoma group. And so the Oklahoma group's interesting because they bring a shit ton of communists with them to Wounded Knee. And these communists are all armed with guns and they all leave once the gunfighting starts. But the Chicanos show up and they have like 12 guns each and start passing them out. So like that, that was sick. But yeah, and there's a lot of cool little stories you can hear about inside the occupation in my documentary that's going to eventually come out. But we have like a lot of Marxist influenced groups all connected, and it's definitely a point that like the camps don't associate with the Dakota Denver group because of like this weird flirtation with Nazis that like was happening unchecked. You know, it's not like these people were like hanging out or anything, but they were allowed to call themselves the American Indian Movement Nazis or whatever, you know, like it, not a good look. And then you have like people like Russell Means, well, maybe the Aryan Brotherhood could be, you know, a useful ally towards an end, you know, and it's like, you sound like the ACP. You know, like, and so like, and then you also have War on Women of All Red Nations. And so they notice all these dudes fighting and kind of overshadowing like the hard work of a lot of women, you know, doing like the behind the scenes stuff, or even like taking their roles in like the Mayflower 2 protests early on, you know, and then they're like, well, we can organize ourselves without you, man. Like, well, you keep fighting, we'll figure it out, don't worry. And then they organize like anti-nuclear stuff. Like they're one of the reasons we know about the cancer rates from well water on my reservation due to the radiation. About 10 years you will have stomach cancer if you drink the well water every day, you know. But with considerable hemp planting and sunflowers, you can pull out that radiation. And so that's like one way we use natural processes to take out poison from the soil just so we can live. It's so like on the land that we were working on, there's 40 acres of self-seeding hemp, a ton of sunflowers. Like it's one of the most beautiful things when you drive down to the land is you see all these sunflowers everywhere. And you like, I named my son after that image in my head, you know, and just the poetic and symbolic meanings behind what a sunflower means, the way they follow the sun, that they can pull the nuclear radiation from the Black Hills. It's sort of a prayer that I hope in the future he can use his Sundance to heal the Black Hills like a sunflower, you know, and it's really deep, meaningful, and
no, I love that. Yeah, I mean, I'm a father too, you know, so it's those types of thoughts I think really resonate with me. So I thank you for sharing that. That's special, you know.
Well, right, and like family is such like an important thing as to why I'm even here on your show talking today. You know, it's because, you know, in all these things that they're organizing, they act as the liaison between the Iranian revolutionaries and the U.S. government during the Carter hostage crisis. You know, John Thompson did that. Thomas, not Thompson, but John Thomas does that, and it's you know what? The Iranians only trusted AIM. What? Like, I make it make sense. I don't know. Didn't other AIM people try to smuggle gun anyway? Like, it's so confusing. But like my grandma and my mom, like my mom writes the youth charter for the Denver Dakota AIM youth chapter. Well, you whatever they're called, youth section. But she wrote their charter, and then when she was like 14 or something, like right around when my brother would have been born, and then different dad, but then they're like some of the primary organizers behind ending Columbus Day in Denver back in the 90s, and then Russell Means takes all the credit in the newspapers and stuff like that, and then does a literal witch hunt on my grandma and gets her banned off the reservation. A literal witch hunt. Called her a witch. Look, I have the recordings.
The literal witch hunt is pretty, in the 1990s, is pretty astounding. That's Russell Means, one of a kind, legend, right? That's why I started the show with him. I felt like he's such an infamous figure. Like, you got to start with him in a way.
I loved it.
You know, we've sort of mentioned, you know, very much in terms of the Black Panther Party, their relation with AIM, both as sort of an inspiration and also material aid. You briefly touched on Chicano movements providing guns at Wounded Knee. So I wanted to sort of get the relationship that AIM had with sort of the new left movements that AIM is kind of a part of in a way as well. You know, the Puerto Rican independence movements, the Chicano movements, the Black Power movements. And then also, and I'm almost scared to ask this question, what was the relations with the old left, with, you know, CPUSA, if there was any, you know, the Socialist Party, which, I mean, is still around, you know, various Trotskyist groups. I mean, the old left was very much back then CPUSA, when now I would say like the old left would almost include DSA, but DSA wasn't around then, you know, like it's weird thing how time works. So what was AIM's sort of relations with very much socialist, Marxist, communist, old left and new left?
It's interesting conversation to have, at least. There's like I said, there's this factionalization that happens. So like initially there's like this broad group support from like, and like not even just talking about US left or Canadian left politics, but like, you know, we have the Sandinistas giving support. We have, I mean, when Leonard Peltier goes to prison, there's a whole rally for him in the Red Square in Moscow. You know, there's Russell Means ends up in China around Tiananmen Square. With David, my uncle from the picture that he flipped with Dave, and Jesse Jackson. I don't know. Very weird. But
all three of those people have very different politics. I love it. It's hilarious.
Well, I'd say David's and Russ's are closer, but like also there's like you need to build a dual power structure from David that Russell just gave lip service to. Anyway, I look at them very closely, so I have a lot of thoughts on their differences and similarities. But yeah, so like you know, there is this interesting connection, right, between the new left and the old left, because you see like the camps bringing CPUSA and the Chicanos, you know, and that's due to like their if you're organizing on the West Coast, you know who you're fucking gonna run into a lot, Chicanos, you know. And so like there was like these in-depth discussions and conversations about, you know, whether the Chicanos constitute indigenous people and should be included on DRIP, yada yada yada. And you know, the ultimate conclusion is that they're a settler, like it's a result of settlerism, you know, and that's just the facts of it. So it's not correct to call them indigenous due to like the relations that produce that nation, but they are still a nation. They are oppressed. There is representation that it must be given and considered when talking about the specific conditions that their nation faces and how to overcome them, right, in liberation, especially as communists. But like obviously AIM, it's a whole thing, and then there's like pretendians and you know, who are influencing the conversation. So there's not, and then you have Zionist natives like Hank Adams, who was like that guy who wrote the Trail Broken Treaties earlier. I should have said that up front, Zionist, but a lot of it was like due to like political expediency. Well, Vine Deloria Jr.'s support for Zionism was political expediency of, if Jewish people can have their land back, give us ours back, you fuckers. You know, like when I look at that situation, it does not seem as cut and dry as you're making it out to be, you know. But you know, and that's why like AIM would you know, connect with like PLO and all kinds of groups across the world, you know, with different stories to accompany them from, you know, one auntie or another. And like it's interesting when looking at, because like there's not the same connections between these factions, right? And then like some take on an antagonistic relation. So like the Chicano movement in Denver did not mesh well with Denver Dakota AIM, whereas like the autonomous groups that, you know, were more supportive of Carter Camp. Oh, I don't know. I'm bleeding for some reason. That's weird. I must have picked a scab, but I was like, "There's something wet on my armrest. It's my blood."
You hit a corner of a table wrong. You didn't realize that happens,
Something like that. But yeah, so like, there's like this antagonistic contradiction coming about due to like a non-consideration through a Marxist perspective of what this constitutes, how to move forward. Like, you can't go backwards. That's not an option. To want to go backwards is appealing to reaction and fascism. The only way to maintain one's tradition is to move forward and evolve. You can't stay the same. Nobody stays the same. No group of people stays the same. You are always changing. Society always changes due to the material conditions. So, and it's not hard to imagine like how we can cooperate with a Chicano, a New African, it's not hard to imagine new ways of cooperating. Then one group gets total control of the land, and at the root of all these is a land issue. And so like you even have like white people with like the Back to the Land movement, joining in, or like the video freaks, like I was mentioning. That's definitely a new left group nobody knows about, but like weird, but these are all, they're all influencing them, and that's what causes the eclectism, really, is that like there is a level of democratic centralism within like national aim, but then you have all these other different groups of aim. None of them are really like paying attention to like national all the time, unless it's like in the news, so they're just doing their own thing, and that's how you get a little Nazi chapter, like what? And so like, there was a lot of promise towards future relations and building like, what we saw in like Berkeley and stuff was like a lot of the third worldist movement would help support getting natives heard as well, because we were so constantly erased from the conversation. And that's due to like the fourth world theory that George Manuel puts forth. And George Manuel was also a huge influence on the Trail of Broken Treaties, from the Canadian perspective. And we just have this, there's no definitive answer, right, to how did they fare, because AIM is such this complex history that, you have some factions smuggling children into Cuba to participate in the Youth World Fair or whatever it's called. And like Marcella Gilbert is one of the kids who went there, and she also went to like Stockholm to speak to the UN and stuff as a young kid, and actually went to the PLO. Like, this is a young woman doing all of this, a teenager, just organizing, because it's a family thing. Madonna Thunderhawk, her mother, she famously says it's a movement of families, and we never really saw like a family of movements that, an inverse of that had those tight relationships in between each other, but were able to maintain a degree of cellular independence, if you will, like a unity through disunity sort of situation. And so, unfortunately, we never saw that coalesce, but a lot of that has to do with infiltration from the feds and stuff. And it's unfortunate that we don't understand this period of history better, right? Like, it's hard to understand. It's been hard like, I've spent almost a half decade of my life. Oh no, I've spent a half decade of my life studying this very in depth, more in depth than most people. And I see it as the perfect lens to start solving the contradictions that are causing a lot of the inability to unify in any meaningful sense. I think it's very relevant that such a perfect encapsulation of the continuation of colonialism into the modern period can be viewed through AIM, and even like a neo-colonial absorption of these radical groups. So like now, after the George Floyd uprisings, AIM started doing community policing and kicking out homeless people. from the Native community. And during the uprisings, that Native community, the elders took it upon themselves to arm themselves and keep the National Guard out of, it's called Little Earth. So they call it urban res. And, they make it a point to keep them out and protect their people. And then AIM becomes this policing group that starts kicking out houseless relatives that need help, and then create the camp that the federal government's already doing on the West Coast. They did it themselves, and then like Red Nation supported it. Maybe Little Earth should make space in Little Earth to protect these people. I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking too far out of line, but I'd love to hear somebody's perspective from that, because the people I have heard aren't very impressed with AIM after that. And, we have this part of the Sundance where we let Heyoka, or sacred clowns, come in and like preach through dance, essentially, the issues, right, that we're facing and need to overcome. And so one of my friends took a Clyde Bellecourt poster and tore it up in front of people's faces, because he was a hero to many people at one point, but while he's sitting there claiming to be sober, he's doing a bunch of cocaine with movement money. When you read these guys' books, it's like a lot of the times they're talking about they were sober. There's a bunch of cocaine usage going on that none of them want to fucking acknowledge, and it's very aggravating as somebody who knows like the tea, I'm like, I've talked to your cousins, you fuckers, I wish you were. Well, and that's the thing is we were supposed to get Clyde's last interview, and his Alzheimer's it was sad. It was really sad. And, I do say constantly, don't meet your heroes, but it's still sad to see, somebody deteriorate like that, cognitively, that had such an influence on the movement you organize in, hopefully towards a better end, right? So it's a give or take relationship with the old and new left, but we see countless examples of cooperation, and the main hurdle being a failure to fully encapsulize the decolonial struggle in that moment.
Yeah, I always view it as it's a national liberation struggle, and in many ways, we always forget that the sort of closing of the frontier is much later in people's minds than I think people really realize. It's pretty much the beginning of the 20th century is when we get the final sort of concentration camps forming. Are you muted?
The last battle is the 1920s.
Yeah, it's very close to when AIM is being founded. It's 40 years apart. So in my mind, it's the sort of rebirth of the national liberation movement and struggle. That's what AIM sort of represents. So it's going to be eclectic. It's not monolithic. No national liberation movement can be monolithic. And plus, the U.S.'s settler colonial relations make it very unique compared to other struggles. So that's just something that we have to sort of reckon with. But just sort of final note here, before we wrap up. Obviously, just to remind folks, donate down below, Cash App, Venmo, right there. I'll put the link also down in the description after the show. Big research trip coming up on AIM, going to Denver, Colorado, correct? Is that's the plan?
Yeah, exactly. The last place I haven't gone is back to where I was born. I was born in Denver. And so I haven't spent any significant amount of time except going through the airport there, because there's 3 airports that go to Rapid City's airport, and one of them's Minneapolis, the other one's Chicago, and the other one's Denver.
Yeah, but the Denver airport's not even in Denver. It's it's an hour away. It feels like it's so.
There was this weird. It's called the Denver Air Connection or whatever, but they sell me a ticket for $65. Like all I had to do was fly into Denver, and I'm like, it's longer, but $65. And it was like actual good seating. That was the weird part. But yeah, so like it's I'm gonna talk to like people like David Hill and stuff like that down there, and then like go to the places that you know, I grew up hearing about. Talk to Glenn Morris, and then my grandma's out in Colorado. I mean, I'm gonna see my grandma, but like it's also to record her, and like she wants to write a memoir, and I think it'd be a nice perspective to write about for sure, and definitely an interesting woman to say the least. I think one of the most eventful things I last heard was my mom claiming that, oh yeah, your grandma abandoned me here in California, took my dog, and then sold it for crack.
Great, love it.
Yeah. It's at least an interesting story. You know what I mean?
It builds character. It builds character. Yep.
Well, it's always fascinating to see where these, like Hugh Newton dies a heroin addict, right? Like it's fascinating to see where people go after being burnt out and disillusioned with, the unchallenged fucking contradictions like patriarchy, colonial violence, like all this kind of shit that runs rampant in organizations and really drives people who are earnestly willing to act in the right ways with the right direction, away from the movement.
Yeah.
Alliances, like
I would love a study on the amount of sort of revolutionaries and organizers that like have substance issues, like have like addictions, because it's that burnout drives a lot of people to that, or it drives people to like become a liberal, like it's one or the other. It feels like,
you're gonna be on a drug. It's either liberalism or heroin.
It's one or the other. I feel like if you're a post-revolutionary. But any final thoughts for the listeners, for viewers? Let people know where to find you, all that fun stuff.
My final thoughts are like, fundamentally, our struggle is for the land, to free the land, not just for one ethnicity, not for all indigenous people, or not for everybody, but white people. It's to free the land because fundamentally the United States serves as the center of an eldritch horror known as capitalism and imperialism that murders people and reaches into the future to even murder them by killing the environment and making an uninhabitable earth. We are at the point that it is revolution or extinction. It is decolonization or death. Okay, that is not a hyperbole, that is fact. And what decolonization means is a return to relations that don't kill us. Like it's not that bad. Okay, I swear to God, it's not an ethno-nationalist thing. We want to live. We want to survive past climate collapse. Hopefully prevent it. But at this point, you fuckers have been a little late to the game. So we got to make do where we are, and we got to start building now. People are already building. You just don't hear about them because you're too focused on whatever crap is popular on Twitter that day. There are countless people I've met across this country doing incredible work, either at home because they are too immunocompromised to leave. They're doing it in their communities. If they have that energy, they're doing it COVID safe. They're being great people about it. I have seen so many and met so many incredible researchers, organizers, and stuff that are bringing to light the realities of this colonial contradiction. That if you really tried it, just look at where you are now and look deep into that history. How does that settlement come to be? Just look into it. From there, you'll go on so many rabbit holes that you will learn an unbelievable amount, way beyond most people. To be considered a good Twitter communist can tell you a lot about the USSR and China's history. How many of them can tell you an in-depth history of their town, how it comes to be, and the material conditions affecting them? You need to know that if you are organizing. You actually need to know that. It is not enough to know how the USSR achieved revolution because you do not know your own conditions to reapply those assessments. You need to know your own conditions and the historical developments that led there in order to perform a proper analysis. It's that simple. And the amount of people who don't know what local tribe their land is, like they are on the land of, it astounds me. The fact I've been asked, aren't all your people dead? It's an uphill battle, but fundamentally you have to acknowledge the ongoing genocide of native peoples here and how it's connected to Palestine. You have to make it an international struggle, not of just away from the U.S. shorelines, but within the U.S. borders and Canadian borders, and acknowledge how those imperial borders bisect nations in order to prevent them from unifying. There is no doubt that the reason why the Tohono O'odham are separated by a border is specifically due to that fact, that they could unite easier. It's the same reason they broke up our nation, formed after the 68 Fort Laramie Treaty. They broke it up into the current day reservations because we started a whole second fucking war. This isn't old lessons. The U.S. knows very well what it's doing. Like, when people look at the CIA and they're like, they're a bunch of bumbling idiots, and it's like, they're really not. You just expect them to be doing something more sinister, like in a movie. In reality, they're just maintaining empire. There's a lot of book work to do for that. You know what I mean? Like, they are the reason why Buttigieg's dad was the translator for Gramsci. Like, one of the best translations of Gramsci comes from Buttigieg's dad, is specifically because the CIA is using those concepts to combat guerrilla warfare and guerrilla scholarship. It is not enough to be an organic intellectual. You must be a guerrilla intellectual that's operating and disseminating their information based on a strategic plan in knowledge of your enemies. You need to know about Operation Signature Reduction. You need to know about COINTELPRO. You need to know about, and if you don't know what Operation Signature Reduction is, it's what Douglas Durham did with those newspaper clippings, except on Twitter today. It's people like Jackson Hinkle, there's so many different examples of things people need to get on the ball of understanding if they have any hope of surviving actual fascist repression. Once we start getting rounded up into camps more explicitly for being communists. Right now it's just, if you support Palestine, we'll send you off to Ecuador. Yeah, I mean, that's basically the big thing. It's a lot more complicated than people want to acknowledge. People aren't thinking when why don't you just write down everything? It's like, well, because I need to choose my words very wisely, because if I make something legible, it becomes usable against me, not just for me. There's a dual usage. It's the classic dialectic of you got to remember, though, it's not always good or bad. It's just a thing. It's a thing that happens, and people can use it however is beneficial to them, the same way they can use, communist rhetoric to a point that's useful for their reactionary ends, yada, yada, yada. But other than that, love talking to you guys. Hope the ranting, I'm trying to fit 5 years of knowledge into 2 hours, so forgive me. I did tell Matt right away when I was sent the few questions. I was like, that's a 3-hour episode. And I was right. I was right, by the way. Just because I'm very used to talking about this, and I know how I ramble. And my rambling style is just the way things were taught to me. Like, if you came to the res, you'd be like, oh, huh, okay. And an oral history brings different crossroads together at different times as they're needed. For clarity, but more for like understanding in the moment, right? Anyway, you can talk to me if you have any questions on Twitter, X, whatever the fuck it's called, at dcolonialmarx, or you can email me at bandsofturtleisland@gmail.com. Otherwise, there's my podcast, the Chunka Luta Network podcast, where you can hear me talk. Not enough. I should be doing more episodes, but again, choosing my words wisely, and then coming to terms with the failures of last year is it's a lot. It's a lot. And when I publish stuff explaining it all, people are going to be like, wow, that is a lot. And as you've heard here with all the tangents and stuff that are somehow still related to the exact history, yeah, I've lived a very eventful life over this last half a decade. And I have met and talked with so many organizers and reservations and different peoples about what I want to see is what unity can be built, and how. And I see the frameworks in my mind's eye. But I can see the skeleton forming of a really good on the conditions of the working classes of America and the oppressed nations within, or I don't know, something like that. I have a lot of working titles, but eventually I'll finish one of these pieces and publish them. And I've come to terms with not being a perfectionist. That was a big hurdle. Was like, it needs to be perfect. I was like, no, fuck no. I just need to talk about this shit somewhat and not in a way that incriminates me. So, yeah, if you have any questions, I've said a lot. Message me immediately. But there's Marx Madness, where I also read theory very confusing. I was a guest, and then they gave it to me. Like you're the captain now. And I went, okay. And then we made a custom Gramsci reader. So if you're really looking to get into Gramsci, which you should, there's a custom reader that you can also download as a PDF and read along with us that Prez put together. Prez has visited Gramsci's grave and stuff. And very interesting person to learn more about, and I think everybody should, especially because he, watched fascism rise. It was on like the first list of roundups, so probably an important perspective if the fascists were that scared. But yeah, other than that, there's a Discord for that if you want to join, and then there's a Patreon that you can support all these efforts monthly. The money gets split between several organizers contributing towards the larger projects at CLM, such as like land work or administrative tasks, stuff like that. And then it pays like for our StreamYard. We want to do a live stream show and stuff, but I got a lot going on. So like I'm trying to like delegate or whatever. But anyway, so it helps pay that. We have a website that we've been putting together for like a year. It needs to be populated with stuff. And so that's like, I have ADHD and like I write like 4 pieces at a time. So I'm like, man, this would be better in this essay. Maybe I'll use both, but worded slightly differently. But and then reading books and then working 40 hours as a line cook. And then I do tamale side gig to pay for organizing. And then there's organizing on top of it. And then like community outreach, blah, 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 blah. I'm a very busy person and I have kids. So I'm tired. I'm tired. Not burnt out, but that's because I rested all winter. But yeah, I went really hard for a long time. And so now I'm trying to get back into the groove of it. And so I figure research trip, go talk to a bunch of organizers, interview them. Then I'll get a bunch of podcast episodes for one. Content. I think it is important to have these conversations with on the ground organizers about their area so people can see that there is this larger mosaic of movement going on. Small, but it's there, and it can be grown and harnessed and cultivated into a larger garden of revolution.
Absolutely. And just for the record, there's no such thing as ramblings. It's dialectical conversations, like that's how it works, and I really appreciate you coming on the show, educating me and the listeners and viewers I would say probably the majority of people that watch the show are leftists of some degree and probably live in a major urban center. That's just how it is. That's what my metrics show. They live in LA, New York. They live in these major places. And I see this sort of disconnect with the indigenous struggle. And I think it's this sort of physical erasure that happens in urban centers, and also like spatial relation. Like, there's this distance, so to speak, from, like Pine Ridge, for example. Like there's this separation from reservations in Southern California, from LA. There's this degrees of erasure that happens. So I think it's really important to educate, especially us white leftists, on these issues, because there just is this information gap I've come to found. Like, that is the biggest barrier to like understanding, is just information, education. Most leftists, when they say really like chauvinistic shit, I should say most leftists, a lot of leftists, when they say chauvinistic shit, it's coming from a place of ignorance. So education, I find, is very, very key to sort of just demystifying some of these things and helping clarifying misconceptions that white leftists commonly have. So greatly appreciate it. If anyone watching and listening, get the like button, share the show, all that fun stuff.
And I have 2 reading recommendations. Blood of the Land by Rex Whaler, to understand more of this history in a more coherent fashion that you can see with your eyes. And then he's a new ager. Don't pay mind to him, but he was there. But and then you have what was it? On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Amongst the People by Mao Zedong.
Love it. Thank you for those reading recommendations. Yeah, and, like you said, if you're out there listening, watching, get organized, like get involved in this process of education. It's hard to do it alone. You cannot do the struggle alone. So remember that. So yeah, the like bunch of the show, all that fun stuff. And I guess we're out of here. Peace.